The title of the show is Forbidden, and I think that it encompasses topics that we don't feel comfortable with in Australia. So the work touches on things like frontier violence, historical issues that talk about attitudes towards Aboriginal women and their sexuality. The work touches on exchanges of land for objects, functional objects like the land deal that's in the show. The show touches on the legislation that was in Queensland in 1897 called the Protection of Aboriginals and the Restriction of the Sale of Opium Act. So it goes into territory that is complex and a little bit tricky, and people don't feel very comfortable talking about race relations in Australia. So that's why it's got that title, Forbidden. It's a little bit catchy and intriguing, and then once you start to unravel some of the meaning behind the work, you start to understand there's a deeper layer of meaning encompassed in different bodies of work in this show. I wanted to know why there were no Aboriginal people living on Fraser Island. Why weren't there Butchulla people living over there on our traditional land? And to understand that question, I posed to my grandmother when I was a very young child at Urangan Beach looking across to Fraser Island. She didn't have a satisfactory answer, and I think as I went through high school and you realise the education system in this country lets you down. So all of my, while I was doing my HSC here in Asquith Girls High School, all we received was 1 week on Aboriginal people, and I was taught about Aboriginal people who come from Central Desert country, and why they have blonde hair is because their fathers were all white. And I knew that quite didn't gel. And so you have these questions, and then I went on to tertiary education, 3 different degrees here in Sydney over 6 years, and those educators at art school were naive about Aboriginal art. They didn't have much of an understanding, and at Sydney College of the Arts they went on a little bit of a recce up to Bathurst Island for a week, and so they came back knowing everything about Aborigines and art in the Northern Territory. And of course my experience was much more different, and there were a group of artists around the time. We'd come from Queensland and various places in New South Wales, and we sort of came together in the mid-80s and formed Bamali Aboriginal Artists Cooperative. After I left those art institutions, those questions were still there. I still wanted to understand about the complexities of race relations in this country. I ended up in the arts, and so, the art that I make is my platform to talk about other things. And so, more recently, in the Christmas holidays, I have there's a huge lull, nothing's happening, so I get out my books, and you can see all those little yellow stickies in there. So over the Christmas holidays, I sort of read these books, by all these different authors, and it's and this is a fantastic book too. She's just new on the scene. But this is talking about Aboriginal children being kidnapped in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and being put into servitude from very young ages, some children as old as 3 years old. It's called something like Slavery. Shirlene Robinson and this other person, Tony Roberts. So there are a number of authors that I read these days in my downtime, and what I find is that I take a long time to think about things, so it just doesn't happen very instantly. So the piece that's behind you, which is called Dispersed, has really come from 2 books, and the name of that book is called The Secret War. and it's also come from this book here, Frontier Justice. And it's talking about how Aboriginal people were eradicated off the land, and it was usually through violent means. So there were a number of massacres that took place in Queensland, and so the word that they used in the reports, they didn't say we murdered Aboriginal people today or we killed Aboriginal people. They used the word dispersed or dispersal or dispersing. So I wanted to do a work about that particular word that was used in government reports. And I read a book like this, long gestation period, and then 2 years down the track, I make a work in relation to what I sort of take in. So I act as a little bit of a sponge and filter this information and try and make a work that, crystallises something very clearly, is understated, but packs a punch and has an aesthetic beauty. So one book led me to another, to another, to another, to understand the silence that we have in this country about Aboriginal people. Why do we treat Aboriginal people the way that we do in Australian society? And so I wanted to really understand the attitudes behind race relations here. Bachelor Woman really was about looking at one historical photograph that was taken in 1899, and it was a striking pose, and her physique was very striking as well. So I wanted to reenact that particular historical photograph where my eye is averted from the camera, the gaze is looking off in the distance, and she's a strong woman looking away from the camera. So the second take on that particular image was the next body of work, or the next photographic series, Native Blood, and I think I got a little bit more game there, and so I donned on the skirt, and you can see some black leggings and platform shoes. And I think for me it's like you've got to spice it up a bit. You have to have a little bit of humour and a play on Aboriginal contemporary society, and have fun with the work that you're doing. So I do like to explore ways of having this sort of jarring edge to the photographic series that I do sometimes. Language is really important because it sets up ideas and notions about how we deal with people and how we look at race. So the two photographic pieces titled Signpost 1 and Signpost 2 really are a little way of looking into a snapshot of one weekend on Fraser Island, and both works are very different, but they're in roughly the same roughly in the same location on Fraser Island. One is on the beach, and the jetty, Mackenzie Jetty, is covered in red tape. Really, it's a metaphor talking about the native title process and how Aboriginal people have been locked up in this legal system where the process is totally out of their hands, and it involves a legality that it binds them. And so, the expression red tape is quite often used in bureaucracy. So this process is really bogged down in a lot of bureaucracy and a legal format of looking at Aboriginal people's rights to their land as custodians today. So they go through this native title process, but it's very fraught with, the legal system. Then the other work, White Trash, really is talking about an underclass that is prevalent in a lot of Queensland towns. So when I visit Hervey Bay or Bundaberg or further up the coast, I'm aware that there is a uneducated Australian population who probably don't engage intellectually in the cultural landscape very much. And so the work is spelt out with op shop clothes that came from the St Vincent's de Paul at Hervey Bay, and it's a work that is very in your face, and I think when white people see that word written out large at Mackenzie Lake, they probably have different ways of reading that. So they might be offended, or they might think it's funny, or they might have some different reaction or emotional reaction to the work. So what I like to do with a lot of my photography is look at race politics and engage people on a very emotional level, so they have a response to the work. There are 7 objects that make up land deals. Some are functional and some are not so functional. Flower forms the huge spiral, and then there's a grey blanket. Looking glasses, which is the mirrors. Tomahawks, knives, scissors and beads. Those were a transaction between the local Wurundjeri people from where the city of Melbourne now is, and the early colonialist who was exchanging those objects for a parcel of land, which was John Batman. So he acquired 600,000 acres of land. I just thought, wouldn't it be great to lay this out and see the physicality of what these things were. So I did have a little bit of artistic license, particularly with the flower, because it wouldn't have been delivered in a spiral. So I got to play a little bit. I write notes to myself, and I do little dinky drawings in a sketchbook. So I have quite a few sketchbooks at home, and they're always sort of half full of ideas. And I write the ideas down, and I sort of, with my photography, I usually work a year in advance. So I have an idea floating around in my head for, it could be, let's say, 2 or 3 years before I execute the work, and then I have to become a little bit like a director. I have to pull people in and get them interested in working on the project. And so I have to be a little bit, I have to be organised.